The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, a flat mechanical sound that mixed with the restless shifting of bodies packed into the benches. It was one of those mornings when the air inside the courtroom felt heavier than the stone walls that held it. Every cough, every shuffle of a shoe against the tiled floor echoed too loudly. The judge had not yet entered, and already the room was buzzing with speculation. People leaned toward each other in whispers, eyes darting toward the front where a single figure stood. She didn't look like she belonged there. A woman in her 30s, hair pinned back without ornament, wearing a plain gray suit that seemed borrowed or bought on clearance. She held a file tight against her chest, knuckles pale, though her face betrayed no fear. She stood at the witness rail as though braced against a storm, her eyes fixed straight ahead. To most in the room, she looked like an ordinary clerk who had wandered too far into the spotlight. The bailiff muttered something to one of the officers, and they moved toward her with the kind of swagger that made the benches lean forward. One officer smirked, sizing her up as if this was entertainment rather than duty. The other stepped closer, his voice low but loud enough for the crowd to catch. "You shouldn't be here." Then, with a sudden motion, he slapped the file from her hands. Papers flew, scattering like startled birds, white pages sliding across the polished floor. The sound of impact echoed, sharper than it should have been. For a moment there was silence, then the laughter came. A ripple of amusement rolled through the courtroom, mean-spirited, like a tide turning against her. Some of the younger men in the back chuckled outright, nudging each other. Even the bailiff's mouth twitched in what looked almost like satisfaction. She did not bend to gather the papers. She stood motionless, eyes still forward, as if the humiliation did not touch her. Her breathing was steady, shoulders squared. The bailiff raised his voice, sharp and dismissive. "You don't belong here. Sit down before you embarrass yourself any further." His words cut through the room, puncturing the silence left by the laughter. From the benches, whispers curled and spread. "She's not even a lawyer." A woman with pearl earrings leaned close to her neighbor. "Just a clerk, isn't she?" Another voice hissed, "Why is she even allowed to speak today?" The murmurs built into a low drone, like the restless hum of bees, until it felt as though the entire courtroom had decided, unanimously, that she was out of place. And still she did not move. Her eyes, calm but distant, flickered only once to the papers strewn across the floor. The file that had been her shield now lay like discarded scraps at her feet. One sheet rested against the toe of the officer's boot. He smirked again and nudged it farther away, as if to underline the insult. All around her, people waited for her to falter, to bow her head, to apologize, to leave the room as quietly as she had entered. That was the role they had already assigned her. The simple woman, the nobody, the mistake standing where authority was meant to be. But she didn't move. She only adjusted the cuffs of her jacket, lifted her chin, and kept her silence. The buzzing lights, the whispers, the smirks, all of it pressed against her like weight. She absorbed it, held it, and let it settle. For the first time that morning, the laughter began to feel nervous. The courtroom's noise swelled and fell again like the tide. A low, restless murmur that pressed against her composure. She remained standing where the officers had tried to diminish her, eyes calm, though to anyone watching she was only a silent figure in a cheap suit. What they could not see, what none of them had ever bothered to see, was the weight of nights she had carried on her shoulders, the years behind her that did not fit neatly into the role of clerk or civilian. Her mind drifted, not away, but inward, back to the hours when she had traded sleep for law books stacked like towers around her kitchen table. Old paperbacks from secondhand stores, thick annotated codes borrowed from libraries, notes scribbled on loose sheets that bore the faint circles of coffee cups. She had sat with a single lamp burning, tracing every statute with her finger, whispering passages under her breath until they became as familiar as prayers. The memory shifted dusty community centers where she had volunteered, pro bono, helping neighbors fight evictions or untangle custody filings. She had filed briefs for people who had no one, stood beside them while official lawyers smirked at her presence, and still she had spoken, calm and certain, until judges leaned back and listened. Each case left her more invisible in the eyes of her peers, but more certain of her own strength. She had haunted courtrooms like a ghost, sitting in galleries where no one knew her name, her pen racing across notebooks while others yawned through proceedings. She memorized rhythms, how lawyers stumbled, how judges leaned on precedent, how silence could be as devastating as an objection. They thought she was a clerk taking notes. In truth, she was building herself into something sharper. Years ago, in the dim quiet of a nearly empty chamber after an emergency night session, one man had noticed. The old judge, with weary eyes and a voice that carried like gravel over stone, had paused at the sight of her still scribbling notes long after the others had gone. He had walked to her desk, leaned on his cane, and studied the page. "You know the law better than most of my clerks," he said, his voice threaded with both fatigue and a kind of grudging admiration. She had looked up, startled but steady, meeting his gaze. "One day," the judge murmured, with the faintest smile, "you'll wear this robe." She had passed the bar years ago, quietly, without celebration, without announcement. Her certificate was folded in the back of a drawer, the seal pressed into paper no one had asked to see. And in the shadows of nights and off-the-record sessions, she had trained under men and women who recognized what the world refused to. They taught her procedure, handed her files, let her call cases in hushed practice trials where no public eyes were watching. The present crashed back like a gavel. The officer standing nearest to her sneered, his voice sharp enough to slice the air. "Take your seat, civilian. Don't waste the court's time." Laughter stirred again in the benches, a few sharp exhales that carried mockery. Heads shook, lips curled, the crowd leaning forward for the moment when she would shrink. Instead, she exhaled softly, almost like a prayer. Her lips barely moved, but the words carried enough weight to hold her steady. "I don't take seats," she whispered, calm and firm. "I hold them." Her eyes rose then, steady, unflinching. And though no one heard the words, the silence that followed bent ever so slightly toward her. The session resumed with the scrape of chairs and the shuffle of feet as the presiding judge entered, robes brushing the floor, gavel striking once against the block. The room steadied, all eyes returning to the front. The simple woman still stood at her place, diminished in the perception of the crowd, her scattered papers left abandoned where the officer had slapped them down. She did not reach for them. She waited, hands folded, posture unyielding, as if her stillness itself were a protest. The case began. Voices rose and fell, attorneys reciting arguments, witnesses shifting under questioning, the ordinary rhythm of the court flowing as though her presence was a mere mistake that would soon be corrected. Then, without warning, the judge's voice faltered. A pause stretched too long. He blinked hard, a hand rising as if to swat away an invisible weight, and then his body leaned forward, slumping against the bench. Gasps tore through the room. Someone cried out, "Judge!" Papers rustled, chairs scraped back as aides rushed forward. The gavel clattered uselessly against the floor. The judge did not rise. A medical team scrambled in from the hallway, pushing through stunned silence with urgent voices. In the benches, people whispered with a panic that grew sharper with each passing second. "Who can continue?" one man asked, twisting in his seat. "The case can't be adjourned. This hearing is too critical." Another voice rose. "We need someone, anyone." The weight of uncertainty pressed down like a storm cloud. A senior clerk hurried to the front, face pale, hands shaking as he shuffled through notes. He opened his mouth, stammered a sentence, then fell silent. His voice lacked authority, his movements trembled, and the murmurs grew louder. The officers who had mocked the woman only hours earlier now exchanged uneasy glances, their postures uncertain. Order was slipping, and with it, the dignity of the court itself. She bent down at last. The motion was deliberate, not hurried, her hands gathering the scattered papers from the cold floor. The sound of shuffling sheets filled the gap of silence, quiet, but strangely steadying. She stacked them neatly, pressed the edges square with care, then rose. While others hesitated, she began to walk. Not rushed, not timid, just calm, measured steps that carried her forward through the shifting crowd of whispers. Her heels clicked against the floor, a sound that seemed louder than it should have been. Heads turned, eyes widened, and the low murmur faltered as the realization spread. She wasn't turning back toward the benches, she was walking to the bench itself. The steps up to the judge's dais felt impossibly tall, yet she climbed them with ease, each motion fluid, unbroken. The robe draped across the chair loomed before her like a gatekeeper, but she did not falter. She turned to face the room, papers steady in her hands, eyes calm. When she spoke, her voice was clear enough to cut through every whisper, every doubt. By judicial protocol, she said, each word sharp and steady, as a certified officer of the bar and duly sworn substitute, I will preside. The silence that followed was absolute. No cough, no shuffle of shoes, no mocking laugh dared to break it. Every eye fixed on her, the woman who had been dismissed as a clerk, as a civilian, as an intruder. Now she stood in the highest seat of authority, her voice carrying not as a plea, but as law itself. The courtroom, for the first time that day, obeyed her. Gasps rippled through the benches like a sudden wind, sharp enough to make the walls themselves seem to shudder. The officers who had cornered her earlier now shifted uneasily, their bravado dissolving as their eyes fixed on the woman standing at the judge's bench. One of them, the same man who had knocked her papers from her hands, leaned toward his partner, his voice a harsh whisper that cracked under the weight of disbelief. She's the judge? His words weren't meant to carry, but in the stunned quiet, they reached more ears than he realized. Heads turned, whispers spread like wildfire. She did not react. Her movements were calm, deliberate, as though she had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times. She reached for the spare robe folded neatly on the back of the chair, the black fabric heavy with the authority it represented. She lifted it with a steady hand and drew it around her shoulders, smoothing the folds with care. The robe seemed to transform her, not because it made her someone new, but because it revealed who she had been all along. A clerk hurried forward, breathless and uncertain, clutching a leather-bound ledger. She extended a trembling hand for the certification card the woman now produced from within her papers. The seal glinted under the fluorescent lights, stamped and signed in ink that carried the weight of law itself. The clerk inspected it, eyes darting across the embossed lettering, then swallowed hard and turned toward the room. Her voice quivered but carried. The credentials are valid. She is sworn. The murmur of disbelief faltered. Skepticism gave way to something else, an uneasy awe that spread across the benches. The police officers who had jeered at her now kept their eyes lowered, their arrogance collapsing in the shadow of a truth they had never imagined. The woman stepped fully behind the bench and lifted the gavel that still rested where the presiding judge had dropped it. For a moment she weighed it in her hand, feeling its heft, the echo of every judgment it had ever delivered. Then she struck it once, the sound resonant and commanding. Order in this court. The effect was immediate. The crowd stilled, whispers cut short, laughter choked back into silence. Every gaze settled on her, no longer dismissive but transfixed. Those who had mocked her earlier now leaned forward with wide eyes, as though seeing her for the first time. Even the officers stood straighter, their faces pale, their authority swallowed by the greater power she wielded without raising her voice. She looked out across the room, her eyes sweeping over every face those who doubted her, those who laughed at her, those who never once believed she could stand where she now stood. Her voice carried steady, strong, unshaken. They thought I was nothing but a simple woman. But the law already knew my name, and now, so does this courtroom. The silence that followed was not the silence of mockery or dismissal. It was reverence, the kind of quiet that only comes when truth has been laid bare and all illusions burned away.